But Logan and Mary and Mary was sick; she wasn't able to come. But they live very uniquely, but actually something that I think many of us can emulate, and that's a rule of life. And that's what I actually want to talk about today. So let's see if we've got. We're still working our technical difficulties, but we're going to talk about a rule of life today. A rule of life. Not rules in the way of that are restrictive, not rules in the way of like legalistic obligation, but what can actually free us to have that margin, to slow down, and then to fill that with more of Jesus. You know, it's the first Sunday of the new year. That might be a surprise to my mom, but hopefully it's not a surprise to everybody else. But in the first year, and beginning of the year is when culturally everybody decides to make these resolutions, right? Everybody's like, I'm going to do this year. This is going to be the year of this. And as a leadership team, we were talking about, before we jump into our next sermon series on a book in the Bible, we want to just pause for a moment and take this opportunity to encourage everybody, and ourselves included, instead of resolutions, to make commitments. All right, to make commitments. And there's a difference there. There's a difference in that. All right. So again, our hope is to skip resolutions, but actually to embrace what's called a rule of life. All right. And that rule of life is a set of commitments. And the commitments are more powerful than resolutions. I'll give you an example. We make habits, not resolutions. Our goals are overrated, but our commitments are underrated. So let me give you an example. Maybe my goal is I'm going to lose weight, all right? But my commitment is that I'm going to diet. I'm going to exercise. I'm going to be disciplined about what I put inside of my body. So you see how the difference is? The goal is, all right, this abstract thing, all right, which all of us would agree is good, losing weight. But the commitment is actually where the rubber meets the road. The commitment is actually what's going to get me to that goal, all right, making those commitments to diet, exercise, live healthy. So actually the commitment is far more important than the goal, all right? The goal won't happen without those commitments. I'm not going to lose weight if I just think to myself, 2025, I'm going to lose weight, and I just go on my way, right? In the same way, spiritually, if we say, well, boy, I want to be closer to Jesus. Everybody in this room is here because you say, oh, I want to be closer to Jesus, right? But what are the commitments and the habits and the lifestyles that we've embraced to get us there? And sometimes that is much less concrete. There's a pastor who wrote this book, which I'll pull up here in a moment, but he has this quote. It says, your mission might stand for one thing, but your habits might stand for something entirely different. Usually, your habits will win, right? So I'll read that again. Your mission might stand for one thing, but your habits might stand for something entirely different. Usually, your habits win. All right. So if my mission is to be financially free of debt, if my mission is to, like I just explained, to lose weight, but if I don't have the habits that are going to lead me there, I'm not going to make it to that mission. All right. Usually our habits will win. And all of us have habits, whether they're good habits or bad habits. All of us have a pattern of living. Every single one of us do things in our daily life that are habitual. Even spiritually, all of us have kind of spiritual habits. Whether you pray before your meal, whether everybody is here on a Sunday. That's a habit. That's a biblical habit. And so we've ingrained these sort of things. We also have habits and disciplines and patterns in our world, what we think of as our secular life, but really shouldn't be different, right? We have habits about work. Okay, I'm going to only keep my work at home or at work, right? I'm not going to take my work home with me. That's a discipline about work. Like health. Oh, I'm going to go to the gym, 3 times a day. I was talking with Frank last year about like how often he goes and walks a certain distance and goes to the gym certain days. Relationships. I recently got engaged, learning a lot, making mistakes, improving. But there's lots of things that I'm learning along the way. And but one advice I was given is have a date night, right? Have a night that's a dedicated date night, right? And that's a habit, that's a discipline, all right? And it's actually been wonderful, and it's helped with the ultimate goal of actually growing closer in relationship, right? So these habits are so important in building the ultimate goal, which is usually part of that relationship. So a lot of people are pretty disciplined. There's people I'm not as disciplined about exercise, but maybe some people are very disciplined about their work, or maybe people are very disciplined about their diet. Maybe people are very disciplined about all these different things. But oftentimes, even if we're really disciplined in those areas, we don't necessarily apply that same rubric to our Christian walk. And why not? Right? Why not? A date night with your spouse or with your girlfriend. That to some people, maybe that sounds, oh, that's legalistic. I just want to be spontaneous, right? But I think anybody that has that would tell you, actually, this is something that has been so helpful and helps us keep sacred this moment and helps us build towards the goal of bringing our relationship even closer together. So why wouldn't we have those same things for the most important relationship in our life, our relationship with God, right? Why wouldn't we apply those same rubrics, those same disciplines, those same habits if our foremost and top goal is to grow our relationship with the Lord? We have to have those habits. We have to have those disciplines. Jesus says in Mark 12, verses 30 to 31, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. All right. It's not just with our thoughts. It's not just with our theology that we love the Lord. It's with our body, right? Our body, our habits, everything that we do. We want to love the Lord. Right? Love the Lord. So not just our Sunday occurrence, not just one part of our week, but we ought to love the Lord with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. Our emotions, our physical health, our thoughts, our joys, our intents. Loving the Lord completely in our life looks much more than just on Sunday, right? Loving him in all these different aspects. All right. You doing okay back there, guys? All right. So I'm going to talk real quickly about the problem. All right. So part of the problem with the way that we view things is we grew up in the West. All of us are the product of growing up in the West. Anybody who's traveled abroad kind of knows that there's something called culture shock. Actually, this past year when we took one of the girls, some of you have met Sela. Oh, thanks, guys. Perfect. Some of you met Sela, and she's like 18. She'd never been outside of the country before, and she grew up in rural Ohio. The biggest city that she'd ever been in, she said, was, what was the town? Charlotte. Yeah. Basically, like to all of us, we'd be like, Charlotte, that's like, that's about the size of Columbus or whatever, that's not really a big city. And then we took her over there, first city that landed in, Tokyo, the most dense city in the world, right? Culture shock, right? Culture shock. This is because its cultures are different. And here in the West, if you compare it to other kind of what we call group or group priority or group thing cultures, we're very individualistic. All right, very individualistic. Let me skip ahead to. All right. Perfect. All right. So we're very individualistic. And sorry, this is just kind of an outline of what we're going to go over here today. So the problem, the solution, and examples about making rules of life or habits. So again, Western individualism suggests that we are just masters of our own fate, right? But there's a famous poem by John Donne, who's a 18th century poet, English poet. No man is an island, right? We're actually all the product of many different things. It influences our parents, our friends, culture. All of those are influences for us. No man is an island. And so if we are all being influenced by something, we have to be intentional about what we're being influenced by, all right? John Mark Comer says this: we're all disciples of someone. The question is not, are you a disciple? It's who or what are you being discipled by, or what are you a disciple of? No one comes to what we believe by ourselves. The world has no free thinkers. We're all being influenced. We're all being influenced, whether it's on our phones, whether it's on our TV, what we watch on YouTube, what we read. We're all being influenced, all right? We have to be aware of that. In the West, though, the idea is that actually everything that I think and everything that I do is actually just a natural outflow of who I am, right? That's where you hear these cultural catechisms, like, right, be true to yourself, or speak your truth, or follow your heart, right? Everything is just a natural outflow of who I am, when actually it's not the truth, right? We're all being influenced by some other things. The world tells us just follow the inner compass of your heart. How many people hear that? I just want to be true to myself. I want to be authentic to myself. Well, the Bible tells us that our hearts are deceitful above all things, and we don't know, right? Con artists say that the best way to con somebody is to convince them that it's their idea, right? It's their idea, it's your idea. And all of us are being inundated by these ideas, especially in this social media age, right? The algorithms are so powerful. Somebody was sharing on Friday that I guess there's a lawsuit out right now that Apple Siri was listening to us, right? Listening to us all the time. all of us have had this advertisement pop up after we were talking about something, and we were like, how is that possible? How did it know? And they were like, no, we weren't listening. They were. They were listening, right? And how powerful, like when we scroll through things we like or click, actually there's billions of dollars being poured into influencing us based on those things, an algorithm of what shows up on our feeds, on our TikToks and Instagrams and Facebooks. We are being influenced. And so in that setting, we have to be intentional about knowing what we're being influenced by and choosing the right things, what we want. Because again, remember, our goal is to become more like Jesus. So if we're not being intentionally formed by Jesus itself, then it's highly likely we are being unintentionally formed by someone or something else. All right. And Jesus says in John chapter 15, verse 4, abide in me and I in you. He's asking us to make him what we abide in, our primary home, our primary place of dwelling. All right. John Mark Comer's a pastor, and he says this, Jesus is not asking us to do something we are not already doing. All of us are abiding. The question isn't, are you abiding? The question is, what are you abiding in? All right. All of us are abiding, whether that's the hours that we spend on YouTube or the time we spend on social media or the things that we watch on TV or the books and things that we read, all of us are abiding in something. All right. And so what is our goal, though? Is our goal to become like the world, or is our goal to become more like Jesus? And the problem is, if we don't intentionally abide in Jesus, there's a twofold problem. One, we miss out on that spiritual development, on becoming more like him. And number two, it produces in us bad fruit instead of the good fruit. It produces in us anxiety, hurry, depression. We are the most anxious and depressed generation. I think I've shared before that antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are the number one prescribed medicine in the United States. I saw a statistic the other day in the Gen Z generation, 60% of kids are on some sort of antidepressant medication. 60%, that's wild. A majority. That means you go into middle school or high school, more than half of the people that you see there, those kids are on antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications. I mean, what is going on, right, in our generation? We have to slow down. Jeremy Linneman is a pastor who's written a lot on this, and he says this, when we lack a consistent and thoughtful way of doing life well, we will end up distracted and overwhelmed by life, and our spiritual and emotional growth suffers. We'll wind up scattered. We'll wind up hurried. We'll wind up reactive. We'll wind up exhausted. All those different things. Logan on Friday night, when he was sharing about Jesus, something that really struck me, he shared about Jesus being probably the busiest person in the world, right? Everybody wanted something from him. The demands on Jesus are far more than the demands on you or me, right? Like, as much as you might feel like you're busy or people want a lot from you, people wanted more from Jesus. Absolutely, 100%. And he had the ability, he had more abilities, right? But Jesus was probably the most unhurried person ever, right? Jesus didn't have a car. He couldn't zoom around to all these different places. He didn't have a smartphone and a calendar. He didn't have any of those things. Jesus was unhurried. Right? Jesus was not scattered, hurried, reacted, and all these different things, right? How can we emulate the master in these things, especially in our time when all of those things, being scattered, hurried, reactive, depressed, exhausted, are far more in excess than at any other time, right? We are the busiest generation. I think I've shared before that, when the internet first came around, the social critics and social philosophers thought, well, in 20, 30 years, like, nobody will even have to do anything. Everybody will be on vacation on a beach all the time because all these efficiencies. And I think you hear the same message now with AI, right? Oh, AI is going to replace everything. We won't even have to work anymore. That's the same thing we thought when the internet first came around. And what happened? It didn't make us less busy. What did it do? It made us more. It made us more, right? And so we're more hurried, more depressed, more anxious, right? And does that sound like your life? I think it sounds like a lot of our lives. But praise the Lord, he's given us another way. He's given us another way. Jeremy Linneman, again, is a pastor who's written a lot of this. And he says this, my experience as a pastor has shown me that many of my friends and church members aren't undone by poor theology or a lack of biblical information. Instead, we often fail to grow spiritually because we haven't planned and made space for a deep, abiding fellowship with God, right? Do we feel dry? Do we feel like we're not growing spiritually? It's like me saying, like, man, I feel like I'm getting fatter, but I don't know what's happening. I've actually said that to Becca before, and she's like, I saw you eat those Christmas cookies, right? Like, it's like being boggled at, like, oh man, why am I, not improving in this area, and yet not making those habits, those practices, those commitments that will lead us to that goal. I love this quote as well. Rich Velotis is a pastor in New York City who's also written a lot on the spiritual disciplines. He says this, our souls were not created for the kind of speed to which we have grown accustomed. Thus, we are a people who are out of rhythm, a people with too much to do and not enough time to do it. Our lives can easily take us to the brink of burnout. The pace we live at is often destructive. The lack of margin is debilitating. We are worn out. In all of this, the problem before us is not just the frenetic pace we live at, but what gets pushed out from our lives as a result. That is life with God. All right. And so that's introducing the problem. And now we're going to talk about, number 2, the solution. There's hope. There is the way that Jesus walked. There is the guidance from his word. There is a better way, all right, that he's given us. Jesus, this idea of Jesus as the rabbi, right? That's what his disciples called him, rabbi. On Friday, Logan shared a little bit on this as well, but the rabbinical structure in the New Testament era would have been very similar to an apprenticeship. All right, apprenticeship we think of these days. When we think today, we think of disciples. We think, well, I'm a disciple, just because I read about certain something. But a rabbi in those times would have had disciples that actually followed him closely, not just read about him, not just heard his words, but actually lived with him daily, walked with him, emulated his actions, emulated his language, emulated his practices. There's a phrase, a blessing that said, in that time, may you be covered with the dust of your rabbi. Basically, the idea is that you're following so closely that his dust will be on you. All right. In the New Testament, we hear a lot about the disciples, but we also hear a lot about the crowds, right? There were thousands of people that came out to hear Jesus speak. But the Bible says there are only a few that actually followed him, right? Many people came to listen. Many people came to hear, but not as many followed him, followed in his footsteps, walked with him, traveled with him. And I think that same practice happens today. A lot of people hear about Jesus. A lot of people say they believe in Jesus. But how many of us are actually following him daily, following in his footsteps, emulating his practices, doing what he did, being with him? All right. It's easy to just say, okay, Sunday morning I'm going to hear a message, but actually walking with Jesus every day, following him as a rabbi, apprenticing under him, that's true discipleship. Only a few followed. It takes practice, all right? It takes practice. For those of you who follow basketball, there's a famous basketball player, and he was asked about his practice. He's like, practice? Talking about practice? I don't practice. I'm talking about practice, right? He just was worried about the game, right? But it takes practice. If you talk to anybody at the highest levels, like an Olympian, right? They have disciplined habits that they practice in order to achieve what their goal is, all right? Adopting habits and practices, aligning their daily activities. And so that question is before us here today in a culture, in a Western culture that is supposedly Christian, right? The statistics show that, majority of Americans still say that they're Christians, but how many in those Barna studies are actually faithfully adhering and following Jesus? This is actually probably about closer to 15, 20%, all right? How many of us, our habits and practices are actually geared towards the goal of following Jesus? Are we being transformed? Are we becoming more like him day by day, month by month, year by year? You're looking back, again, it's the start of 2025. Looking back at who we were in 2024, are we more like Jesus today than we were a year ago? We should be. We should be. If we're following him, if we're practicing, we should be more like him year by year. We should be being transformed year by year. There's this idea of discipleship, and I think in cultural Western Christianity, there's this idea of discipleship as, I've had people come and ask us actually here at Faith Oak Bluff, hey, do you guys offer discipleship? What they really mean is, hey, do you offer a set, 30-minute therapy time where I can sit down with you one-on-one and you'll listen to my problems, right? Like, that's what they mean. And again, I don't it sounds harsh, but that it's truly what they mean. And I think there is a place for listening and hearing people one-on-one. But when you look at the New Testament, is there a verse where Peter says, hey, Jesus, can we sit down for, 30 minutes and one-on-one, I want to tell you my problems, right? That wasn't the model that Jesus had. His model was an apprenticeship. The disciples followed him, lived with him daily, emulated him and his practices, right? So discipleship we've conflated, I think, with therapy. And I think there's a role for therapy. I think there's a place for therapy. But discipleship has been replaced as a verb, right? It's an action versus apprenticeship, maybe the better definition of discipleship, and that's a noun. You are an apprentice. Because if we view discipleship as a verb, something to be done to us, then it's somebody else's responsibility, right? You hear a lot of people that are hurt and they leave a church, they said, well, nobody discipled me, right? And that's viewing discipleship as a verb. It's somebody else's responsibility to disciple me, to bring me along, to guide me, to feed me. But if we view it as a noun, it's actually our own responsibility, right? It is on us to be an apprentice, to emulate the rabbi, the master. I love this. Comer says this: if discipleship is something that is done to you, a verb, then that puts the onus of responsibility for your spiritual formation on someone else, like your pastor or church or mentor. But if disciple is a noun, if it's someone you are and or are not, then no one can disciple you but Rabbi Jesus himself. All right. I think it's a powerful exhortation for us, especially in this new year. Are we going to be disciples as a noun? Are we going to be apprentices? There's a threefold discipleship that Comer suggests. It starts with being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and then doing like Jesus did. And the structure or the framework that has been given to us throughout church history to do that is what's called a rule of life. All right, a rule of life. And rule comes from this Latin word, means regula, kind of like a ruler, a straight edge. And in the ancient Mediterranean practices, that word would have been used for a trellis. So if you guys look at vines, or if you guys, like, Becca's got a bunch of stuff planted out in the backyard. I can't pretend to know very much about planting things. But I see where there's trellises actually allow that vine to come up off of the ground, that plant to come off the ground and produce more fruit. It's not the trellis, if you look at it, it doesn't look very different than a fence, right? People would look at it and say, oh, actually it's constricting, right? It's locking something in. But actually it's not. It's actually producing a framework that allows that plant or vine to produce more fruit, to be more healthy. It provides a guide. That's what that rule comes from, all right? Rule of life exists not to restrict, but to create order for maximum fruit bearing. All right. I've been reading this marriage book, and one of the chapters was talking about how we in the West view marriage. A lot of people, and I'm sure you've heard this, say like, "Oh, marriage is restrictive, right? Marriage is old-fashioned. Marriage, is not necessary. Just love who you love, and when that love or emotion dies, then move on to the next one." Or somebody might say like, "Oh, I don't need a piece of paper to prove that I love this other person, right? I'm just going to live together with them, and marriage is actually just restrictive." But that's not the biblical view of marriage. Marriage, actually, for anybody that's in marriage, would say, actually, marriage is a framework that allows us to be fully free and vulnerable and naked with one another. It is more freeing to be married to your spouse, not in this, what the secular world would view as a restrictive contract, is actually, biblically, is freeing, right? It's good. The same way, rule of life, having these disciplines actually frees us to bear more fruit, to become more like Jesus. And that's the goal, right? We don't pray just for prayer unto itself. We don't fast just to fast unto ourselves. It is actually, the goal is a relationship, right? The goal is a person. Our reward, our fruit at the end of it is Jesus. To be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, to do as he did, right? I think Sean said on Friday, fasting without like Jesus in mind, it's just a diet, right? It's just a diet, right? Our goal, all these structures are unto the goal, and he is the goal, becoming more like him. Again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, our commitments have to mirror our goal. If our goal is to become more like Jesus, we have to have the commitments to do it. And this is historical. This is not something new. It's not something fresh. John Mark Comer is a very popular pastor and teacher. He's current, but it's not something he came up with out of the ether, right? This is actually something that has been part of church life since the beginning. So the Didache is a first century document. They think it's as early as the first church. And it is, in essence, a rule of life. It's an instruction manual for the believers in how to live their lives. Again, first century rule of life. And in it, there's a couple of different chapters, but many of those chapters talk about spiritual disciplines, prayer, communion, living together, Sabbath, fasting. All these different things were part of the early church's rule of life. It's not a new thing. It's been since the beginning. 4th century monastics. We've talked about Benedict before. Benedictine monks. Their rule of life is called the Rule of St. Benedict. It's probably one of the most famous rules of life. And in it is a huge, long document, but basically guidelines for the monks on every single aspect of their life. But most importantly, the tools for spiritual discipline. So chapter 4 talks about good works, fasting, even sleep. How often to sleep? When should you go to sleep? What your sleep schedule should be like? All right, that may sound restrictive to us, huh? Oh, yeah. So, and giving, all these different areas, all right, in our life. Again, loving the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength and body, right? The Lord wants all of our habits in every area of life to be unto that goal of becoming more like him. Chapters 8 through 18 in that rule talk about the divine office, basically times of morning and evening prayer, or set hours of community prayer that we've been doing here. Monday through Friday, morning and evening prayers is what we've emulated here. This is not a new thing. It's historical, right, the church. Psalmody. I've been talking with Logan a lot. Logan and Mary lead us out on Wednesday mornings where they sing the Psalms for us, all right? The psalmody psalmody means singing the Psalms, and that's what they were intended to do. We've got a book out on the front there, but basically it's this Christological book on the Psalms. But every single psalm can be sung towards Jesus, and that's what the monks did. They would sing through the entire Psalms and sing it to Jesus, right? Not read the Psalms, sing the Psalms, pray the Psalms. There's a difference, right? We can read the word, or we can actually pray the word, all right? And that's what they did. That's psalmody, singing the Psalms. In chapter 20, reverence and prayer. So all these things, again, another example historically of rule of life. Another one that I thought was really cool is called the Brethren of the Common Life. Maybe not as widely known, but in the 4th century, they were a pietist group. I really loved reading about them because they actually remind me a lot of our community here. All right, all of them had jobs. Right? None of them had alms. None of them were dependent on almsgiving. Almsgiving is basically a lot of monastic communities would just depend on people helping them, giving them money. But the Brethren of the Common Life very much emphasized education. In fact, before there were even schools or universities, they were responsible for much of the literacy in Europe at that time. All right, they taught people. All right, they said you have to go to school. You can't just sit around and do nothing. You got to go to school and you have to have a job. All right, and they also focused on rule of life, all right? Personal piety, all right? Practicing fasting, giving, simplicity, prayer, all right? And in fact, they influence, even though you may never have heard of the Brethren of the Common Life, they influenced some of the greatest teachers of the Reformation. Erasmus and Luther both came out of the Brethren of the Common Life. I could go on and on and on a whole day. I love reading church history, but we can talk about the Moravians. We can talk about Methodism. We could talk about all these different things. All of these have that DNA of rule of life, all right? Being disciplined about prayer, fasting, times of communion together, community, all of these things. They're not restrictive. They're not a new thing. It is a common vein, a common DNA throughout church history. Right? And hopefully I've proved that a little bit. So monastics, mystics, pietists, all these different words for all these different things. You think, oh, maybe that's not for me. I'm a busy person in 21st century America. There's no need to enter a monastery to do all these things. You don't have to become a monk. You don't have to shave your head to do it. All right, all of us can apply those same principles to our life the same way that Jesus and the early church and the disciples did. All right. But you may hear a lot of objections because a lot of it sounds probably new, and there are a lot of objections. Again, that same objection, one of the main objections would be, doesn't it sound restrictive? Isn't it putting us in chains? Isn't it legalistic? The answer to that is, the reality is a rule of life is what makes possible all the attitudes and actions that we are harder to come by when suffocated by the habits we've adopted unintentionally. I'll read that again. A rule of life makes possible attitudes and actions that are harder to come by when suffocated by the weight of the habits we have adopted unintentionally. All right? And again, going back to what I've talked about, all of us have unintentional habits. All right? So we're not asking anything new. It's not suggesting anything new. It's actually suggesting changing what those habits are to better align with our goal of becoming more like Jesus. All right. Comer says this: in a culture that equates authenticity with spontaneous emotions, I think I have a slide for this. Yeah. In a culture that equates authenticity with spontaneous emotions, habit is a tough sell. But show me a person's habits, and I will show you what they are truly most passionate about, most dedicated to, most willing to suffer for, and most in love with. And I will show you who they will become. All right. Our habits mold us. All right. We all have them. And so it's not a question of it's restrictive or not. Are your current habits restrictive? Yeah, they're restricting you towards a goal that is not the Lord, right? Changing those habits into something that will move us towards those spiritual disciplines of becoming more like Jesus is the goal, all right? Another objection is that we don't have enough time. But yet statistics would show us actually we absolutely do. If you have an iPhone, you can actually look at your iPhone and it'll tell you how long you spent on it. Every time I look at that, I'm shocked. I'm like blown away, all right? You're like, there's no way that I spent that much time on it. There is. It's on. It doesn't lie. It's tracking all the time that you have it open. The average person, according to statistics, spends 2 hours a day on social media and 3 hours a day watching TV or some form of YouTube or TV, right? We have enough time, brothers and sisters. We have enough time, all right? A.W. Tozer said this: "It is well that we accept the hard truth now. The man who would know God must give time to him. He must count no time wasted, which is spent in the cultivation of his acquaintance. He must give himself to meditation and prayer hours on end. So did the saints of old, the glorious company of the apostles, the goodly fellowship of the prophets, and the believing members of the holy church in all generations. And so must we if we would follow in their train." All right. Again, I hope that I've shown just a glimpse of that throughout history, this is not a new thing, but it's consistent with church practice, and that those objections don't hold weight. All right. Moving on to examples. All right, I'm going to close with some of these examples. Rule of life has looked different for all those different communities throughout time, but many of the elements of rule of life have been consistent. All right. A great resource is Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. It's a book that has kind of been a staple of spiritual disciplines in our modern era. But he talks about a bunch of different disciplines, and he categorizes them, I think, very helpfully in disciplines of abstinence and disciplines of action. Okay, disciplines of abstinence is what I'm going to withdraw from. Disciplines of action, actually what I'm going to lean into. All right, and here are some that he recommends: solitude. I think I misspelled that. Silence. Sorry, I should say silence. Fasting, frugality, chastity, secrecy, sacrifice. All right. Disciplines of engagement, things that we're going to be proactive in doing: study, worship, celebration, service, prayer, fellowship, confession, and submission. All right. We have the book in the library if you want to look at it. But I'm just giving you ideas because at the end of this, I'd love for all of us to actually commit to that. Again, not making resolutions for the new year, but making commitments. I want to talk about a few of them, again, that throughout history have been consistent with all these different groups. And one of them is fasting. Back to that Didache, that first century document, that rule of life from the early church. The first chapter talks about fasting. Fast for those who persecute you. Chapter 8 talks about fast on the fourth day and the preparation day. All right. So when people talk about fasting, people will always say, well, I don't have to fast, right? And yeah, the Bible doesn't say you must fast, right? But Jesus does say, when I'm gone, they will fast. The expectation was that they will fast. And even if there's not a commandment, if we are emulating the rabbi, if we're walking in his footsteps, what did Jesus do? He fasted. What did the disciples do? They fasted. All right. And the early church fasted on Wednesdays and on Fridays. And actually, we would love to invite all of us here at Faith, Hope, Love to do the same. We're actually moving. We had fasting days on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. In this new year, we're actually going to move our fasting days to Wednesdays and to Fridays. All right. And Wednesdays, if you've been here on Wednesdays are kind of our nighttime breakfast, all right, our break fast. That's what breakfast is breaking fast, right? We're actually going to break fast together on Wednesday nights, eating together, all right? So Wednesdays and Fridays brings us in line with actually what the early church did, fasting 2 days. The benefits of fasting as a spiritual discipline is to recognize our spiritual hunger, right? We're embracing physical hunger to identify our spiritual hunger. Actually, on Friday night in the guys group, we were actually talking a little bit about being hangry. One of the other guys, his name's Jonathan, was sharing with us. He was like, man, I tried to fast these last couple weeks. Man, it feels like every time I fast, I just get spiritually attacked. And we actually talked about how actually embracing that physical weakness reveals what's already there, right? It reveals the spiritual issues within us. You've heard probably people say hangry, right? Hangry is a word that people have used just in the last 10 years. They're like, oh, if I don't eat, I'm hangry. Well, actually, it's not true. Actually, you're angry. And eating just masks it, right? Eating actually just masks that you're angry, right? So I'm an angry person, but nobody knows it because I'm always physically full, right? I'm always physically full. And so actually embracing that physical hunger reveals the spiritual underlying issue, right? And when we hunger and thirst for spiritual things, Jesus says he's going to fill us. He's going to fill us. So fasting has been a consistent spiritual discipline throughout history. And again, going back to what Jesus says, he says, my disciples will fast when I'm gone. There's the idea of the bridegroom fast. Matthew 9:15, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast, right? He says that about us. We will fast. I don't mean this as like a condemnation. I don't mean this as if you don't fast, then you're not following Jesus. I'm just suggesting that if we truly love the bridegroom, we ought to fast. He promises that there's rewards in it. There's a messianic view of fasting, and one of the writers says this: as long as the disciples had Yeshua with them, they were tasting the joy of the messianic era, and it would not be appropriate for them to frequently fast. However, once he left them, they indeed would fast once again while they were waiting for his second coming. Beck and I have been reading this book by John Piper on the second coming of the Lord, and John Piper said something that struck me. He said that the measure to which we love Jesus' first coming is measured by how much we long for his second. Right? How much we long for his second. If we're not excited about his second, do we really love his first coming? All right. So that bridegroom fasting, again, embracing that hunger, that recognition that actually things are not okay until my bridegroom comes. Right? Longing for that wedding day. Somebody who's engaged, a newfound view of that, like longing for that wedding day. You told me, man, I had to wait. Jesus has been waiting 2,000 years for his wedding day, right? I mean, we should also enter into that hunger. So again, I invite all of us to enter into that fasting, whatever it may look like. Water fast, Daniel fast. If you need tips, if you need help with that, all of us in the leadership team, we can ask any of the elders people here to help out with that. Fasting can look a little different for a lot of people, but we should all embrace it to some extent. All right. Prayer, Faith, Hope, Love. You're here at Faith, Hope, Love House of Prayer. All right. It's a hallmark of what we feel like God has called us to do. Prayer. Regular times of prayer together as a community. The sacred trust, you guys have heard us talk about it before. Right? Embracing a commitment to say, I'm going to spend this time with the Lord. All right. And not just praying, interceding. A lot of us are familiar with intercessory prayer, asking for things, right? And it's okay to ask for things, but fewer here in the West are familiar with contemplative prayer, right? Actually just gazing on the Lord. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians 3:8. We all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit, right? Paul exhorts the Ephesians to contemplate Jesus, to look upon him, to gaze upon him. And there's a principle in the Bible that we become what we behold, right? Are we watching YouTube all day? Are we watching people argue on Twitter? That's what we'll become, right? If we gaze upon the Lord, gaze at his beauty, Paul says we're going to be transformed. Psalm 27:4, hallmark of the prayer movement. One thing I desire of the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and gaze on the beauty of the Lord and seek him in his temple. That's the desire. All right. Comer talks about how to be with Jesus, abide in him. How to become like Jesus, experience his love, right? In a place of prayer, we can experience his love. It's like sitting with the person that you love. You don't have to say something. If I have a relationship with Becca, my relationship with her is not based on asking her for stuff all the time, even though sometimes I do. Like, hey, can we do this or can we do that? But actually sitting with somebody that you love actually sometimes means not saying anything at all, right? And actually sometimes maybe that is when you're most comfortable with somebody that you don't have to say anything, but actually just to gaze at them or experience their love, right? And there's this principle that we can only love as much as we've experienced. Jesus says we love because what? He first loved us, right, in the Bible. We can only love if we've experienced love. We can only give what we've received, right? If we haven't experienced Jesus' love, how can we walk out and practice that love? So as a general rule, we become more loving by experiencing love, not hearing about it in a lecture, not reading about it in a book. I can tell you about Jesus' love. You can read about it all you want, but unless you sit and experience it and commune and contemplate with him, how are you going to know it, right? All right. So again, that's why young kids who have had a good family and good parents, they have a much better ability to give and receive love in the adult lives, right? Same way, we have to experience the Father's love in order to give it, right? So, prayer. All right. That's Paul's desire for the people in Ephesus, that he would grant to you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height. I'm not going to dive probably running over time, so I'm not going to dive into communion too much, but part of what, as a leadership team, we felt called to do is actually to do communion each time that we gather together. And this is not a unique thing. If you have questions about it, please come and talk with us. But we want to love communion, love the body and the blood. John Calvin said this: we should do. He wanted them to do communion every time the word is preached, at least weekly, if not more. All right. And the early church did that. Their gatherings together were centered around communion as often as they could gather. Some practical tips for doing a rule of life. There's this teacher named Early that I've already mentioned him. I included this little quote from Logan. I loved it on Friday. Basically, he said, if you have church hurt, don't think of it as a rule, okay? Think of it as a practice, all right? Rules sound constricting to people. Think of it as a practice, all right? So think about all these different things we've mentioned: prayer, fasting, community, communion, reading the word, all these different things. Break it down into daily, weekly, monthly, yearly practices that you want to uphold this year, 2025. Maybe that yearly practice, I want to read through the Bible in this year. Daily practice, I want to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. That's what the Didache says. Pray it 3 times a day. This teacher, Justin Early, he says he actually gets on his knees. His rule of life is that 3 times a day he's going to get on his knees and pray, all right, at 3 set times of the day. I mean, if you look at other religions, you look at the Muslims, they are disciplined about doing that, right? How much more can we do that? And he says that actually getting on his knees actually physically postures himself in a way that allows his spirit to posture in the same way. He actually gets on his knees. I was challenged to do that. I'm going to try to do that more often. And monthly goals, all right, monthly things. I'm going to fast. Weekly goals. I'm going to fast once a week, all right? So break all these things down into what you're going to do daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. His examples of things that he has on his rule of life: scripture before the phone. When he wakes up in the morning, before grabbing his phone, he's going to read the word, all right? Every day, he's going to have 1 hour with his phone off. Every day, he's going to have 1 meal with another brother, sister in the church, all right, or in the community. Again, I mentioned kneeling prayer Monday, midday, and bedtime. Weekly, he's going to have 1 hour conversation with a friend. Are we getting together? Again, we've talked about, as a spiritual family, are we loving the people in this room? Make it a commitment to get together with somebody in this room at least once a week, all right? He has other things about social media and fasting and rest and Sabbath. And if you're part of our Sacred Trust commitment, Sacred Trust is part of this rule of life. And I invite all of us to embrace Sacred Trust as not just the 2 hours that we commit to as prayer in the week, but actually committing to fasting, committing to Sabbath together, committing to these things. John Mark Comer has a couple of different parts of his rule of life, and I won't read all of them, but basically there are things that we've hit on so far: fasting, prayer, scripture, solitude, Sabbath, community, generosity, all right, witness and service, all right. So all these different things, aspects that you can add to your rule of life this year. All right. I'm going to close with this. That's a lot of information. I've through a lot, and I've gone over time, but it may sound daunting. But the good news is actually it's an invitation that it's not that we have to do, but that we get to do, all right? So I'm asking you not to add one more thing. I'm actually asking to change what we're already doing in order to better align it with our goal of becoming more like Jesus. And praise the Lord, it's good news. He said his burden is easy and his yoke is light. He's the good shepherd of Psalm 23. He lays us down in green pastures, all right? So again, the invitation is to say no to things that might be good in order to say yes to things that are better, right? The best thing. And lastly, I want to say that we should do it together, all right, to do it together as a community. I think Logan shared really well on this on Friday. We don't do it alone, all right? It's a common rule. They said it's common rule because it's part of the community. For us to be a community that embraces these disciplines: Sacred Trust, to set time for community prayer, all right, to fast weekly, to give generously, to practice Sabbath and rest together and communion together. It's easier when we do it together. This is a picture of Eliud Kipchoge. He holds the world record for the fastest marathon. But if you look at it, marathoners always run their fastest when they run together, right? So if you look in the background, there's a whole team of people running with him, all right? We want to run this together. All right. I'm going to invite my sister back up to pray, but to a time of response. Oh, no? Okay. Oh, let's go to communion. Okay. Well, all right. We're going to enter a time of communion. All right. So, but pray about it, all right? And many of us on our team are actually going to ask you guys this week, if you're not part of Sacred Trust, consider joining Sacred Trust. Our Sacred Trust is our rule of life. Sacred Trust is our version of rule of life, all right? Setting times for prayer, fasting, communion, and Sabbath, all right? Well, let's pray.